Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. This week, International Women's Day has been celebrated across the globe, but men still rule the world. That's not a controversial claim, it's a fact. Women are heads of state or heads of government in just 22 countries. At the current rate of progress, the UN calculates gender equality among heads of government will take another 130 years. In Gibraltar, the Minister for Health paid tribute to the women in Operation Freedom on International Women's Day. Samantha Sacramento celebrated the fact that women have fronted teams, including the Director of Nursing, Sandy Gracia, who we can see on the left. The government says she was tasked with delivering the local vaccine programme. But here are some other images. Platinum Command, which sits at the top of the civil contingencies structure, just Minister Samantha Sacramento there. And in our parliament of 17 MPs, just 2 are women, Miss Sacramento again, and apart from the Health Minister, Together Gibraltar leader Marlene Hassan Naon. So just 2 from 17, that's 12% compared to the worldwide average of 25%. So, how far have we come? How much further do we need to go? And how do we get there? Questions for tonight's panel. Welcome to Jennifer Ballantyne-Pereira, who's an academic and a historian. Thank you for joining us, Jennifer. Welcome to Catherine Morgan, Non-Executive Director and Actuary. She'll be talking to us, among other things, about numbers. And welcome to Fiona Young, who's an employment lawyer at INS and has some relevant experience to share with us. And before we get into the discussion, thank you to Women in Enterprise and also to the Federation of Small Businesses for helping to produce tonight's discussion. So, equality, how far have we come? Who wants to have a first crack of the whip?
Well, if only to say that one of the most pressing questions I think we ask ourselves every year when in the lead up to International Women's Day is, how far have we progressed? Is our messaging getting through? Are we making a difference? I think that your intro now really was quite placed a huge mirror up at society, really, in asking the question. If we, for the last 30 years so Women in Enterprise is born from a business network that's for women, and then we became Women in Business. So over the past 30 years, we've been commemorating International Women's Day. And we're still asking ourselves the same questions. So yes, perhaps we need to begin by asking, well, maybe we haven't progressed as much as we would have expected, and ask the question, why? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
OK, so do you agree with that? I mean, we tend to think that progress has been made, but not enough, perhaps?
I think this year's theme, Choose to Challenge, and the challenges that we're being asked to put out there by the international women's community, saying that this has been a challenging year for people, but we also need to make the challenges that there's been a lot of discourse, there's been a lot of dialogue, there are many, many events. But are we actually seeing drastic change? Your statistic there that it's going to take us 130 years. And yet, when we are seeing women in leadership positions, we're seeing very, very forward-thinking, very progressive, very competent leadership. And so I think that's the challenge for this year, is to make a lot of the discourse into reality and see how we are going to make that real for many, many women throughout the world.
OK, so COVID has changed everything in society, Catherine, and it's an opportunity as well as a challenge, isn't it, to sort of try to use the disruption that it has necessarily brought to say, well, what do we want from our society as we try to recover?
Absolutely, and I think the whole challenge idea is a great one, and it links absolutely to the culture that Jennifer was talking about. There is research that shows that companies that have a better culture, more inclusive, more emotionally aware, more caring, actually make more money because they have fewer sickness days, they have fewer people leaving. And then there's more research that shows that those companies, companies run by women, tend to have better cultures. So the only logical conclusion is that companies run by women make more money. And I think that is a really good challenge for us.
What we don't know is what comes first, though. We don't know if it's having more women or if it's at a successful company that has the right culture that therefore... Is that right?
I think the research shows that you need the women in charge in order to have the better culture. So
Okay.
you really need to have more women at the top of organisations.
Sure. Okay, so choose to challenge. What's the basic message there? Spell it out. Spell out the logic. Challenge ourselves. Challenge inequality. I mean, I suppose it can be interpreted in a few different ways.
I'm assuming that the idea came about from what a challenging year this has been for the entire world. And it's a great word to use because it's such a play on words. We've all been challenged. We've all been pushed out of our comfort zones. But challenge isn't just about the struggles that you go through. It's about challenging yourself. It's about pushing yourself. And I think that's where the dynamic of it's actually been one of my favourite. We get a hashtag every year. So we've had Each for Equal. But this one's been my favourite because it's just so present and necessary for the times that we're living in. And as you said, COVID has really, really pushed everyone back into their homes and so really demonstrated the challenges that women face in trying to get this juggle and this work-life balance. And it's made it very prominent.
And there's a fear, and there's evidence to support it, that women will be disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting because the choose to challenge is a very affirmative statement to make because it indicates agency. We choose to be able to step forward and act upon things and challenge anything that may be stopping us in our way. But the reality is that women are most disadvantaged by this COVID fallout, really. Not only have they been frontline workers, but also because they're working within perhaps a domestic setting, more involved with their homeschooling, with everything else. And I remember reading a very interesting statistic in The Guardian, and this was during the first lockdown. And it's an area that I'm interested in, academics, that during lockdown, output, published material by male academics, shot up during the lockdown, whereas for the women academics, it plummeted. So it wasn't that... It was that it became very difficult for women, I think, to be able to homeschool, keep their research going. And it seemed to be easier for men. And this again goes back to the culture, that there must be a different way, an approach towards work. But the challenge is great for women because if they're pushed increasingly into a domestic space, for many other reasons besides COVID, perhaps in a downturn that is expected in the economy, who will be the first out? Where will the redundancies come from? And women are already disadvantaged at some level because of, biological function, which shouldn't be a determinant, but it can be when you go on maternity leave, when you become less able, I think, to compete at that level because you may have a 6-month period of maternity leave. What happens when you come back? And I think that maybe, Fiona, you have some very brilliant points about this, about how women will challenge, but they're already having to... Really, it's an uphill struggle to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, before we get to those, then thank you. They're not all mine. I get them from various things that I read. But before we get to that, I think let's just, to be fair, to say I think pushing us back into the domestic place did demonstrate, where you've got relationships that have equal status. I think it gives men the opportunity to shine as well in that family setting. And depending on people's own circumstances, I think it's interesting to see, and depending on the sorts of jobs they were doing, it's been interesting to see. But I think for a lot of men who didn't get the opportunity to see the dynamic at home of their wife or their partner with the children, it was a real opportunity to see just how time-consuming, how much of a juggle, and how much of that. And there are plenty of men out there who got themselves involved in that, and I think they should be celebrated. And those dynamics are the dynamics that we're looking for. But exactly as Jennifer said, it just also really, really puts the microscope on the challenges that women have to face. I mean, there was a brilliant post out there. There's been lots and lots of information on social media, and you know, as a senior partner in Gibraltar, has talked about, you know, the difficulty of trying to juggle, you know, wanting to be there to put your child to bed, but also wanting to be there with your clients and the needs that your work is facing. And it's a disadvantage. And although the law is sort of providing support for women, the reality of it is the place where we're still sort of struggling to put that fit.
So the law gives women who have been treated unfairly a recourse to try and address that and get compensation?
Well, so if we just step back from that and look at what laws are in place. So here in Gibraltar, we have the Employment Act that protects all employees and sort of governs employment relationships. And within there are laws protecting against discriminatory behaviours. We then have what I would say is the most important act here, which is the Equal Opportunities Act, and that takes from the UK's sort of Equality Acts. And that really sets out very clearly that a variety of different protected characteristics, but tonight we're focusing on sex and gender. So women have very clearly established, and they've been set down over many, many decades of women really having to fight these cases all the way up to the highest courts and into the European courts to be able to demonstrate that by biology we are not disabled in the workplace. We shouldn't be prevented from carrying out our careers. So those laws are in place. What I'm seeing and what my colleagues in employment law will be seeing, not just here in Gibraltar but all over Europe and in the UK, is that the reality of that is the employers don't always comply because it's easy for you know, hopefully the people won't take to the tribunal. They can't afford it. It's going to take too long. You know, there's a lot of different hurdles to get through to the tribunal. And actually, you know what? You could probably just settle the case and weigh it in the balance. I can still get rid of this lady. I know it's discriminatory, but I know that I can pay her a settlement. But the point is that lady has then lost her career as a result of that breach of employment law. And the settlement, he has to start again. And now actually has, you know, a baby at the same time, if we're talking about sort of a maternity-based sort of discrimination. And I think it's also really important when talking about the law, because we do focus on women and children, but there are, you know, there's discrimination against women who don't have children. There's discriminatory behaviours. There's this concept of this glass ceiling where you're just not progressing because you're a woman. And I don't know the reason why that's still happening in 2021, but I can assure you it is.
Yeah. And we had a chat before we started. We had several chats in recent days. And you wanted me to remind or to pose the question that it's not just women that are impacted by such behaviours, although they stand to gain the most from them. But everyone should be interested in such unfair treatment, employment treatment, being done away with.
Yes, because treatment of people that is not discriminatory is respectful. So the opposite of discriminating somebody is being respectful towards someone, regardless of race, colour, you know, ability, disability, gender. And so it's about respectful behaviour. And I will often have male clients who really do feel that they're being discriminated against or treated unfairly or being prevented. And I think there'll be many male viewers watching this going, well, I have a female boss and I feel that she's awful towards me, you know, because people who aren't respectful towards one another don't treat each other nicely. It's as simple as that, really. And so when we're looking at law that protects people, it's about respect, and it's about the word, which I think we're going to start using a lot now, is culture.
Culture, because this is it precisely when we were having our discussion. One of the terms we said was, well, why can't people be kind to each other anymore? And we were talking about how, well, I'm sure if you asked any of us if we'd experienced any sort of like sexism or bullying, I'm sure most of us would say yes at some level. But I remember having this conversation with my husband over, you know, just something that happened. And he said, yes, I agree with you, but you don't realise that men also get spoken to and dealt with in a very aggressive manner. And he was saying, we no longer talk to each other, and we don't. And in the workplace, it seems that we don't have a culture of kindness, a culture of knowing how to talk to each other. And I remember just looking back, you know, Jane Austen has been considered like a feminist in that the marriage market and etc. But one thing that her books are very important in is that they provide a manual teaching us manners, teaching us how to behave towards one another in polite society or in any society for that matter. And I think that the boundaries now have so been eroded that we don't know how to treat each other professionally anymore, perhaps. So it is about culture. But this is really the crux of it. How do we, all that we've been saying here now, how do we prove it? How do we know that this is
We need some numbers. Catherine, do you have any numbers?
I don't have numbers on culture. What I do have is a study that I was reading about in the Harvard Business Review on how to measure it, because you think culture, it's quite fluffy, it's quite subjective, it's all about feelings. No. It's you can actually measure it. So one of the studies that I was looking at, they look at emails, Slack communications, other means of electronic communication. Obviously, you can't necessarily look at when people are talking, but when they're communicating with these other methods, you can look at the language that is used. There's tons of information there. You think how many emails we send, how many Slack messages, how many WhatsApps and so on. Pull that language out, look at the relationships and look at the kind of language that typifies a company. And these people are using artificial intelligence to analyze that language and say, this is telling you something about the type of culture. How are they treating the people who are a bit oddball? How are they treating the more creative people? How are they treating the geeky type people? How is that leaking in their language? So it can be measured. There are ways of doing it.
Okay.
You just need to
and before we go any further, for anyone who has any doubt as to whether there are issues apart from representation politically, shall we say, which, you know, the numbers were we outlined them at the beginning. If you look at pay by men and women and by occupation, there are some very clear patterns that perhaps you can talk us through, Catherine.
Yeah. So women across Gibraltar are generally paid less than men. Obviously, some women earn more than some men. If you look at this chart, it shows you the average monthly wage, and you can see that women are earning less than men. But there's quite a lot of information that's hidden here. This is just all women compared to all men. So some of the things that you might want to think about. So on this chart here, you've got part-time versus full-time. More women work part-time than full-time, which obviously reduces the average wage, and that shows you that that's hidden there. This next chart looks at different types of roles, and you can see that for all roles, apart from machine operators, women are earning less than men. And the machine operators, you can't really draw a conclusion from because there are only 11 female machine operators in Gibraltar. And it's interesting going back to the part-time versus full-time, because in the UK, when they look at this type of data, they split it down by gender, then by full-time, part-time, because that has an impact. They also look at types of roles, so more skilled, professional, less skilled, and so on, but also tenure of employment. And interestingly, the gender gap on pay increases the longer that you've worked somewhere. So as soon as you join, it's about 5%. After 20 years, it's a lot bigger. And that's quite interesting. And that's something that's really useful with statistics. You can look at the surface, and then you need to cut down into the detail and look at it, try and cut and slice and dice it different ways.
So we could sort of hypothesize that maybe the starting a family has something to do with that dynamic. But the more important point that you're making is that you need to be able to look at data beyond the headline figures.
Exactly. Yeah.
But just to recap, if I may, Catherine, the pay gap in Gibraltar, as last measured in 2019, was 19%.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which is roughly in line with the UK. But again, you've got to dig into that figure to look at the part-time, full-time, to look at the spread of jobs. So I think if we look at CEO pay, sort of senior level pay, then the proportion of women earning over £60,000 here it's not 50-50. It's a very small proportion of those people. And then when you look at the senior roles, one of the graphs that was on there, the women in senior roles are earning 70% of what the men are.
This is the managers, isn't it? Yeah, 72%.
Yeah, so that gender pay gap is 30%, not 19%.
Yeah, so that means that for every pound that a senior manager will earn, the woman will earn 72 pence, which...
And it's worse than that, Jonathan, because that knocks onto your pension as well as that. So this is not just a point-in-time thing. This lasts for your entire life.
And this is within a profession, so we're talking about people who should be similarly skilled and...
Absolutely.
Similarly useful and valuable to a company.
Yeah.
Okay, so much ground to cover still, I guess. So we've talked a little bit about full-time work versus part-time work. The other point that you have, I think, made there, but just to spell it out, the stats in Gibraltar are available as PDFs.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So I looked on the Gibraltar Statistics Office website, which has lots and lots of information, and it's really good. You can download it. It would be lovely if you could download it as an Excel spreadsheet, so you could actually manipulate it. I had to type it into a spreadsheet, which was really irritating. And then it would also be really good if there was more granularity. I think statistics are great. As Jennifer said, it holds a mirror up. So the more statistics you can get, the clearer your mirror, the more pixels you have in your picture.
Yeah.
And then the other big advantage is once you start collecting the data, you can then measure as time goes on. So when we're challenging each other, we know where we are in 2021. When we come back to talk to you in 2025, Jonathan, we can go, yay, the gender pay gap is this much. It's a lot lower, and it's for these reasons.
Okay, and you can inform policy,
exactly.
Which importantly is a key element over here.
So you get data-led policy.
The data-led policy.
Yeah.
Once we understand the whys and
exactly.
and then that mirror becomes far more, I'd say, illuminating.
Yeah.
We've talked about political leaders. We've talked about managers generally. CEOs specifically, there's an interesting fact about the number of CEO women in the FTSE 350 list of companies.
That's right. And I think Fiona's husband is one of the lucky ones because he's called Peter. So there are more CEOs called Peter than there are women.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, the extension of that statistic is there are more CEOs called Peter in the Netherlands as well than there are women CEOs in the Netherlands. And Peter isn't even a popular name in the Netherlands. So it is quite extraordinary. And this point about women leadership, and you've just demonstrated it with the stats, which is great. But it's great we've got the stats. Terrible that we have this stat in existence, that as you stay longer in a career, and this is the point I was saying about I don't understand why we hit the glass ceiling. I mean, one element, as you've said, is having your career curtailed because you've chosen to have a baby, and potentially having that career curtailed for you, even though you're prepared to juggle and challenge. But that's only one element, because there's plenty of women in the workplace who choose not to have families or don't have families for whatever reason, and yet we're still not seeing this progression through. And I mean, if you just take law, for example, you've got the same number of law graduates, male and female. It's literally 50-50 split. I think with training contracts, you get the same number, male and female, going in. And then somewhere down the line, we just disappear. And it's the same idea of then you get to leadership levels and it's men. And you know, there's been mention this week of the idea of meritocracy. I'm completely for the best person for the job getting the job.
But how do you measure that?
But how do you measure that? And if these women are falling by the wayside and not being promoted, and not having, and I won't be so stereotypical to say not being invited to the golf club. That was what the discourse used to be about. But you know, we all picked up our golf clubs and learnt to play golf so that we could, you know, we could get there too. So that's not the issue. It's that somewhere there is an ideology, a culture, a stereotype that women don't belong there. And personally, when I think about it, I wonder if it's just history, if it's just through history, women were sort of protected or they were historically sort of put down for whatever political reasons in history. I'm talking about hundreds of years ago.
Considered inferior.
Yes, exactly. And we're stuck with that, even though we can now prove that we can really have the same brains and the same capacity and can really do the same jobs.
But it's even more than that, isn't it? It's the diversity and the unique skill set that women leaders are bringing to not just businesses, which you touched upon, Catherine, but also governing whole countries. So perhaps, given that we started off talking a little bit about COVID-19, we can talk about the fact that the majority of countries that have been more successful in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic are headed by women. And maybe, I don't know if any particular countries, any particular leaders have caught your attention in recent months.
Well, New Zealand.
Jacinda,
yes.
Yeah, Jacinda's amazing.
But because she's quite outstanding in holding her ground, just in a very measured, in a very engaging manner. But she's managed to have New Zealand
empathy,
practically COVID-free.
Yeah.
But I think it's about the manner, about the engagement, about the vocabulary. But having said this, in your comments earlier, Fiona, women do use a different language. And it's a lot about soft power projection rather than a more of an aggressive. And I think that culturally we need to place higher value on how women will project, on how women will express, and the vocabulary that they use. And I think this is where culture is important, because, I mean, clearly we're never going to get there otherwise. We have to change this.
And perhaps a slightly different example. So when Barack Obama was president, he had quite a lot of women in his team. And even with Barack Obama as president, they found that they weren't listened to. You know, it's that old joke, oh, that's a really good point. Can you just let one of the men make it? And what the women did was they got together outside the meetings that they had with the presidential team and agreed that whenever a woman made a good point, another woman would say, oh, that's a great point, to make sure that they were heard, because they were just not being heard in meetings, even with Barack Obama. So that's the kind of cultural change.
It's that voice isn't heard, that vocabulary isn't understood.
But this point about soft skills is quite interesting as well, and it's one of my pet subjects. That the term hard and soft skills came from the army, and it was about leadership. And soft skills is about dealing with people, and hard skills about dealing with artillery. So the senior leaders had the highest soft skills in the army because they could manage people and they could lead. And that's what we're saying is that that's where women excel with our soft skills.
Excellent. OK, well, much more to discuss in part 2. And if you'd like to put a question to our panellists or make a point yourself, you can do that. Viewpoint@gbc.gi, #GBCViewpoint. You're watching Viewpoint, of course, and our live discussion here at Broadcasting House will continue after a very short break. Stay with us.